Sometimes a well-meaning person will come up to me after a worship service and say something along the lines of, "Jason, you really led me to the throne room." Today we're going to talk about why your worship leader can't really do that and why that's good news. In the Garden of Eden, the triune God made man and woman in his image to live in perfect communion with him. We walked with God, talked with God. Our joy was full, unbroken, and unending. But then we rebelled against the Creator and we fell out of perfect communion with him. The curse brought about by our sin shows just how holy and severe God is. But God made a promise in Genesis 3 of a rescuer who would come to deliver us from our sin, which shows just how kind and merciful our God is. We were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and the longing that we have to return and find unending joy and fulfillment was then passed down from generation to generation to generation to you and I today. And because of God's holiness and our fallenness, there's always had to be some sort of mediator in order for us to be with God. And God, in his kindness, has continually made provision for his people to worship and enjoy him. We see in the Old Testament book of Leviticus the introduction of the sacrificial system. And God's chosen people, the Israelites, didn't bemoan this sacrificial system because it was the best thing going for them. And if they wanted to worship God, to be with him, they would do whatever it took. And this is why a mediator was so important. God gave priests to mediate between God's holiness and our sinfulness. And the blood of an innocent animal will be taken to show the holiness of God, the sinfulness of man, and the magnitude of mercy that God gives through the sacrifice of innocent blood. And this is why the New Testament book of Hebrews says, without the shedding of blood, there would be no forgiveness of sins. And now I briefly say all of this to just show the extent that a holy, holy, holy God would go to in order to draw near to his sinful and broken creation. Habakkuk says God's eyes are too pure to look on evil. David the psalmist says in Psalm 5, "You are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you." The holiness of God demands holiness. And this is why we must have a mediator, because even on our best days, none of us are without sin. 1 John 1:8 says, if we say we have no sin, we are lying to ourselves. We're deceiving ourselves. The truth of God's not in us. And I think many people coming to church on a Sunday feel that something is wrong because of their sin. It's hard to go from a fight with your spouse in the car to lifting your voice and hands and singing to the holiness of God. And I don't want to be harsh. I want to be helpful today. The reality of our ongoing sin creates a need to have an ongoing mediator, a priest who can give you access and maintain your access to God. Because of this, many feel the weight of their sin, and they see a person on stage with a microphone who relates to them and yet stands before them and seems to have this kind of special connection with God, and they latch onto them as if they are their personal high priest who can give them that access to God. And the problem is that your worship leader standing before you may have just had a fight with their spouse the night before, or perhaps they let anger get the best of them and they yelled at their kids earlier in that week. The truth is, you need a better mediator who can bring you into the presence of God, and your worship leader can't bear the weight of giving you that access to the throne room. Only Jesus can. Only Jesus can give you continual access to God. He is our great high priest. Psalm 16:11 says, God makes known to us the path of life. In his presence, there's fullness of joy. And Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. Jesus is the path of life. It's him alone who gives us access to God's presence. He is the true and better worship leader. Only Jesus is enough for you. And that's good news, because you don't have to hang the weight of your hope on a talented vocalist or the perfect song selection or the right style of worship. You get to rest your full weight on a Savior who was crucified, buried, risen, and ascended to intercede for you at the right hand of the Father until one day when he comes back for his church. So next time you want to encourage your worship leader, you don't have to thank them for bringing you to the throne. Only Jesus can do that. You can thank them for how they point you to Jesus and that you love worshiping with them.